we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I discovered, for lack of a better word, my next guest when I saw a fascinating piece he wrote in that was published in Common Dreams that made me think, which is always something I appreciate. The headline given it, I don't know if it's his headline, Consumerism, Another Inheritance from the Slavery System. In doing so, I learned more about my next guest. His name is Jorge Majfud. That's spelled Majfud. If you want to find him, Jorge Majfud is an Uruguayan American writer. He is an associate professor at Jacksonville University, where he teaches Spanish, Latin American literature, and international studies. And he has a new book out in Spanish entitled La Frontera Salvaje, which I guess translates as The Wild Frontier. And I guess the translation of the subtitle, 200 Years of Anglo-Saxon Fanaticism in Latin America. I look forward to it coming out in English as well. I hope it will. But without any further ado, Jorge Majfud, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard, for inviting me to your show. That's an honor for me.
Well, it's an honor to have you. And before we get into the whole question of the article you wrote, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the title of your book, The Wild Frontier. That's a correct translation, right?
Yes. And just the first word, frontier, is very, very meaningful because if you translate it as a frontier, frontera, you are missing a lot because right. Different culture, different language think different way. In this case, it's very clear. For example, for the Anglo-Saxon mind, frontier is not a border. You have two words. Right. We have only one. For us, border and frontier is the same, frontera. So it's a line that separates two different countries in this case. But from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, particularly the American Anglo-Saxon tradition, frontier is something that you have to, or you can, if you can, push and push and push and conquer and take if you can, as much as you can. That's frontier. It's a wide area that is open to exploration, as it used to be said in the 19th century. So that was the Indian territories, the wild frontier. That was the Mexican territories, the frontier. That was Latin American continent. That was the last frontier. Ronald Reagan, many other talk about Central America as our last frontier. Actually, it was Argentina, the last frontier in Latin America. And then other countries in Asia. But look at the irony. Border from that set of mind is something that you have to defend of invasion. That's an irony. And you have many multiple examples, for example, very clear example, not just theoretical or more abstract understanding of the problem, but thousands of examples I put in the books, actually, in many cases, but the books is not focused just on that. But for example, many people who, very recently, in the 80s, for example, who helped the Contras against the Nicaragua government, the Sandinista, and they helped the terrorist group of the Contras with how to torture, how to rape and kill, etc. They came back to the U.S. and began to defend, like Minutemen and many other paramilitary groups that were many here in the U.S., never called paramilitarism, but associated with the KKK and many other paramilitarism groups. Paramilitary groups, and they say we're here to defend our borders, and they used to hunt and persecute very poor migrants in the border, and they actually killed many of them. And that was, we had to defend our borders because they are Latino people, poor people, brown, black people are invading us. But we have the right, historically, since 200 years ago, to invade them, to conquer them, to impose, to promote a lot of, or many military coup, bloody military coup, since the 19th century, even recently, and in the name of freedom and democracy. Nothing rare because that narrative was already in practice when the Southerners who dominated the American politics after Andrew Jackson in the 30s, they radicalized the divorce between narrative and reality. So Racine was an institution in here since the foundation, since we the people, who never considered the black people, obviously, not even Indian or Mexican. But during the 30s, that was more openly Southern politics. And they expanded not just over the Indian territory to expand slavery in the name of freedom, as Andrew Jackson said, we have to take the Indian land to give to the white people, the white farmers who are the real lovers of freedom. And why that? To expand slavery, because very few, like Cherokee tribes, used to have some slave, but because they copied that institution from the Anglos. But most of that territory, the slavery was non-existent, was zero. And not to mention Mexico.
If I may interrupt, you also quote,
yes.
You begin the book with a series of devastating quotes from American officials over the years, and one of them talks about negotiations with Mexico breaking down over the question of slavery because Mexico plans to abolish it, the United States does not, and so on. But this is exactly why I wanted to start, Jorge Majfud, with a discussion of this word, which in Spanish, has this dual meaning, border or frontier, because it seems to me it's essential for understanding the political situation we deal with in this country now, to understand that, first of all, it's almost like what in the police shows you see those one-way mirrors. It's a border for anyone coming in. It's a wall for anyone coming in, but it's wide open for us in looking from the United States out, and not only wide open in the sense of frontier, but with manifest destiny, God wants us to take it. So this to me is a fundamental, and I wanted to, if you'll just indulge me, I don't know if you would have heard of, there was a children's show when I was young, many years ago, called Davy Crockett. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's based on a guy who I think was quite a self-promoter as well as a soldier, wound up running for Congress and serving in Congress, clashed with Andrew Jackson. And this is in real life, clashed with Andrew Jackson, actually surprisingly, from a more enlightened perspective, but then fought against the Mexicans at the Alamo and was killed. And he made himself a mythic figure. They made a TV show about him. And I doubt you've ever heard the theme song to that TV show, but every child could sing it when I was young. And the refrain was Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. And the lyrics, I won't read them all to you, but it says, first of all, it says, killed him a bear when he was only 3. Now, that didn't strike me as something I wanted to do as a child, kill a bear, but he claims he did it. Fought single-handed through the Indian War, in derogatory for Indian, to the Creeks. The Creek tribe was whipped and peace restored. I won't quite tell you the whole thing, except it ends with, he packed up his gear and his trusty gun and let out a grinning to follow the sun. So, there's more, but basically, children of my era were, brainwashed, I would say, to believe in this notion of individualism, of violence, of quote-unquote taming the frontier. And isn't that, in a sense, the living example of the tradition that you're describing in this book?
There are many points there. And just before I forget some of them, let me connect with a very important book written by my friend Ariel Dorfman, How to Read Donald Duck. That was a very subtle analysis of popular culture, media, or cartoon for kids, that had a lot of indoctrination, ideological indoctrination, that normally say, well, it's just for kids, it's naive, innocent. Well, that's very important because it was designed for kids, even when they were or not aware or conscious about what they were doing, but they were spreading out a clear ideology. But the whole Hollywood and the whole movies did the same and still do the same job. But for example, in the same period, in the 70s, in People's Magazine, John Wayne said, we did nothing wrong with the Indians. They had too much land, and they were so selfish that they didn't want to share with us that land. So we had to take it. We had to take it. There were around 3 million, or the same Indian population than white population. Probably white were much smaller population, and they needed more and more land. A few weeks ago, I was driving Georgia, Florida, and you drive hours and hours of empty land, right. Forest, no cows, nothing. And even today, when you have the resources to travel very fast, you feel that it's a huge land. And in the 19th century, they felt they need more and more land. That was not they need land, actually. They need to conquer and to eliminate the inferior race, as they say. That was very clear in the press. So they are inferior races. They had to be eliminated by the superior white race, and many people agree with that. But going back to, for example, the case of the narrative and reality, when Texas became independent, as you mentioned, Mexico was trying to legalize that. Mexico did legalize, outlaw the slavery, and the problem was that Mexican government gave away land to a piece of land, not all Texas, but just a piece of a smaller area to Anglo farmers. And they pledged to obey the Mexican law, to become citizens, to pay taxes. They never paid tax, etc. And the problem was that they brought their slaves. Mexican authorities said everything is okay, but if you bring your slave, they are not your property. You have to free them. They are also welcome, because the runaway slave used to cross the Mexican border in order looking for the freedom, and that was when Texas was a part of Mexico. And once Austin lobbied in the capital of Mexico for a decade to make Texas an exception in order to keep slavery for life in Texas, he failed, and many others failed. The solution was independence. And independence, even today, many of my students in college, in the university, say that it was to expand freedom. Well, that was the narrative at the time, and it's the narrative today. It was because Texans were not free enough under Mexican law. They never said, or rarely said, that that was the freedom to enslave other people, as many other critics in the 1840 or so clearly say that was just to reinstall slavery in Texas. And what happened when Texas was annexed to the Union under James Polk government, that he completely invented a war that General Zachary became president and General Ulysses Grant became president. They say that is a kind of a joke. We have no right to be here. We're just provoking Mexicans who don't want to fight any war, clearly, and they are just looking for an excuse in order to say we were attacked first. That was the false flags. And once the North, during the Civil War in 1860 began, what did Texans do? They joined the Confederacy and tried to break apart from the North because of exactly the same reason. History is very logical. They wanted to keep that sacred and particular institution who was slavery, and they say the best way to advance civilization and freedom was to advance and to protect slavery. And they put that in the first Texan Constitution because this was sacred. So the language saying we're fighting for freedom, it was for their freedom. and fighting to reestablish and keep slavery as there were. And let me connect very quickly with something I heard yesterday from President Biden in Geneva. He said, I just printed here, how will it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it?
Right.
What will it be? What will it be like if we engage in activities that he, in this case, he is President Putin, engaged in? It diminished the standing of a country. Biden is not naive. It's not. It's not Trump. He has a long experience, half a century of experience in the government. And that reminds me what Reagan said in the March 24th, 1983. Americans, in making their Western myth, were not put off by discrepancy with reality. Americans believed about the West not so much what was true, but what they thought ought to be true, etc., etc. So in that case, it was not a criticism; it was a vindication. And not to mention that the Western, the cowboy, was the Mexican culture adopted by the new Anglo immigrants, illegal immigrants, when they took California, etc., and expelled all the new Americans who were the old Mexican. And since then on, even today, they are the foreigners just because of their faces, their accent, etc. They were
and you've written about that as well. Yeah, in the book, the ultimate irony to me about Biden's comment yesterday, we report on Thursdays, Biden's comment on Wednesday, the ultimate irony to me about that is not only that everyone knows the United States has long interfered in the elections and politics of other countries, but in fact, Putin himself would not be president of Russia today if we had not interfered in the 1990s in the Russian political process. So he is our creature, he is our creation, and to say in the context of meeting him, we don't, there's the evidence sitting next to you on the podium that in fact we do interfere. So I did pick up on that aspect of it.
Like Taliban, etc., right?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Like many other creations, like Taliban and many others in Latin America, etc.
Right, because we wanted to harass the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And so, but the fascinating thing, and so far, by the way, I just want to note, we've talked almost entirely based on a single word, frontera. But that's good because it's almost a gateway to these other things. It's good for me. I would say, you're a novelist, so you understand the power of words, of memory, of imagination. And I would say in this country, the fascinating thing about these words, one of the fascinating things, is the manipulation of memory and imagination. The fact is, to this day, I've been to the Alamo. I don't know if you've gone, but to this day, remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo, not as it happened, it's like Total Recall, manufactured memory of the Amazon. Remember the Alamo. Remember the frontier. Remember how we won our freedom with guns, when guns themselves, the American love of guns was developed in large part to catch runaway slaves and do that sort of thing. So, here we are, in a kind of, we were creating virtual realities before computers were invented, I think, and living in one now. So I guess before we move on to consumerism, I would say, do you have any additional thoughts about that? The myth of the frontier.
We can add to what you mentioned with the Alamo. It was a myth. Again, John Wayne was the producer of that movie, and actually didn't want some black people playing a certain role there. But he was a racist and supremacist as well, even when it was denied, but every action indicate that. But the Alamo was the part of the myth creation. But then if you read the old newspaper in the 19th century, the fake news are very clear. You had many newspapers that were very critics with Washington's policies, and many others that began to play that game. I suspect that the language is very important for what was called the American democracy, which was not. Let's start from there. Also, the U.S. was not a democracy, at least until Lincoln, and then there were many coups when some black people won some election in North Carolina, for example. There were literally violent coup, and they removed them, etc., etc. But as a legal system, it was a perfect dictatorship. Only 10% of white male people were able to vote, very few. They were, most of them, wealthy. And after Andrew Jackson, poor white people felt incorporated to this ethnocentric elite, but that was not a democracy. You cannot call a country a democracy when you have slaves, when most of the people had no human rights either. So that was not a democracy. But the contradiction between the language and reality was very important, I suspect, for the US more than to any other dictatorship or imperial power, because they needed to create the concept of union because of the deep divisions they experienced here, not just with the 13 colonies. That was very important during Benjamin Franklin's. He invented actually the snake and wanted the snake as the symbol of the U.S. because the eagle was, he said, had bad habit because still other animals, their food, etc. But the need to reinforce the union was very important from the 13 colonies, but also because the racial divisions and North-South divisions, many divisions. The immigration, for example, we prize the melting pot, etc. But the immigrants were never welcome here in this country. For example, the Irish were considered dogs, and they were killed also. They were not white until the 20th century. Then they became white and had put a president, Kennedy, in Washington. But there were many conflicts between different levels. So that is why the union word, concept, narrative was so strong and so repetitive in order to deny the reality. It's like the American superhero that wears a mask but has a second personality. That is central in the American culture. The double personality.
Yeah. For something I'm writing, a long-term project, I just wrote about yesterday. So there's synchrony there. And I guess in terms of the memory aspect of this and the self-deception aspect of this, have you ever seen, we could close, have you ever seen a movie called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance?
No, never.
There's a film director. There was a 20th century film director named John Ford, wonderful director, but very politically conservative. He made Western movies, a number of John Wayne movies. And he made this movie about a newspaper man who's kind of a Davy Crockett character and gets credit for killing this bad guy and goes to Congress, becomes a senator and famous. And then you learn at the end that it was really John Wayne, the quiet, shy man who killed the bad guy and let the newspaper man get the credit. And this reporter who works for him says to his editor, "Don't we need to tell this story?" And the climactic line in the movie, and to me, it sums up the American self-delusion. The climactic line is the editor says to him, "When the truth becomes the legend, print the legend." And that, to me, that's American media, American myth-making. You know, I think a lot of people who covered Biden yesterday, a lot of those reporters knew how often we involve ourselves in other elections, but when the truth becomes the legend, print the legend.
Yeah, and it's part of the religious training. That's it's a reality. Deny my belief. I had to repeat many times until I see something different. But that is, you mentioned recently, repeat certain myths like remember the Alamo, but also who invented the yellow journalism? That was invented in 1898 by the New York newspapers. And they make up the war, the Spanish War,
right.
from nothing. The crew said that we have an accident here. And immediately in New York, just to sell more and more copies, they sold actually 1 million per day. They just invented and many very respectable directors and producers, the New York Journal and the New York World fight each other for the customers.
Right.
And they invented that war. And after that, what happened in the school, what happened in the pop culture, remember the man, so on and so forth. So it's a religious mind that needs repetitions in order to, first of all, deny reality. Secondly, to change reality, to change the past, and you change the present. And nobody cares about the truth. What really matters is what I believe. I want to confirm that with repetitions.
Right, and it's very lonely if you step outside that system. So Jorge, I don't want to neglect the original inspiration for our conversation, which was this piece on consumerism. Now, I and I think many others have thought about consumerism as a kind of form of diluted slavery, in the sense that people, desire products, they go into debt to purchase them, whether it's a car, a nice home, new TV or whatever, and then this debt or this need for continued borrowing ability, in a sense, enslaves them or locks them into certain jobs, certain lifestyle, and so on. But you did more here. You actually looked at the history of, in the Caribbean particularly, instilling a desire in slaves so that they would be more cooperative. Am I getting that wrong?
Well, that's what is happening even today. That was an invention, but it was not an accident. It was British knew that was going to be the way to replace traditional slavery, to make people to decide things and to make them to make them keep working and working hard for almost nothing, wage slaves. And then, of course, the U.S. or Washington, or the U.S., I prefer to talk about Washington because the U.S. is a very complex country, huge country. People think different, so I don't want to put everything in a single box. That is very dangerous. But I would say that Washington also designed, first of all, through many business men like Sam Bananas, many banana wars and banana dictatorship in Central America, try to make them to work harder and harder and voluntarily. And the narrative was also very, very important. And the CIA, after 1947, replaced the FBI in Latin America and began to a much more aggressive cultural fight. And, they inoculated the media, like in the US, Mockingbird operation, in Latin America was called Sinsonte, etc. So just the power normally accepts certain changes and try to use them in their favor. And the power is expressed in many ways, in secrecy, as in the CIA has done largely, but also in white, in the media, in a more open way. So power also reinforces itself through politics, through media, etc. And if at the beginning of the 19th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, workers were wage slaves, they had to work 16 hours or so. And here in the US, by the way, there were many worker organizations that literally disappeared. They were demonized. That was also a very important American tradition. And that was slowly demonized and disappear, and then they became, or we became, a different kind of slave, more happily slave, that devote our salaries, almost everything we have, or our time, to consume, to have more things, to the concept of status, the concept of having the last iPhone, etc., etc. And we don't have a life that we are trained to consume and to consume. We are slaves, and we have to work even more and more and be very, very worried about our job, because if we lose our job, we lose healthcare, we lose everything in our
yeah.
life. So we are not free as we can. And some people say, well, but capitalism give all this progress. That is also part of the narrative. We, humankind, has been making a lot of progress. First of all, technological progress, social progress since centuries. And we are the result of all that tradition of progress. The man on the moon or internet, it was not the internet was not Bill Clinton's or Steve Jobs' invention. That's ridiculous. That's just there are two faces. But everything was invented before. Even the 1,000 years ago, the algorithm was invented by a Muslim mathematician in what today is Iran, and without, not to mention all math, etc., not to mention the concept of democracy, of the human rights, or non-discrimination, fight in favor of minorities, etc. That was not invented by capitalism. So we are modern slaves that say we can be worse because look at those countries who are failing. Of course, they are failing because they are not in the center of the system, like Cuba, for example, or other countries. They are blocked, they are harassed. I'm not saying that that is the model for the world. I'm saying it's obviously they are going to fail. China is not failing. This is even a worse, more tough communist system. Saudi Arabia is a terrible dictatorship. Everybody is rich there. Nobody say they are failing. So they are not the democracies, and they are very modern countries, very huge, beautiful city, etc. So that's what really matters is who has the power in a certain moment, capitalize the whole history progress and say, look, we invented everything. You are not in the worst situation thanks to us. So you have to thank us because you are not dying at this moment. You live a little longer than your grandparents, so on and so forth. They are kidnapping all the progress, all the narrative, they are putting a moral situation completely morally, in a very moral way. But that's the part of the narrative.
And Jorge, it seems to me this again is a kind of manipulation of the human mind, among other things. And in order to keep us on this, wheel, like the hamster wheel or whatever. And, one of your talents as a writer that I really admire is this ability to find quotations through history that really are self-incriminating. I think you're almost like the magpie, the bird that finds the shiny objects and puts them together. And your piece begins with 1833, 10th of June, Rigby Watson, a member of the British Parliament, quote, to make them labor, meaning slaves, and give them a taste for luxuries and comforts, they must be gradually taught to desire those objects which could be attained by human labor. And then he goes on, he elaborates. But to me, that's it right there. That's, we've been gradually taught, got to have the new flat screen TV, have to have the new car. And I'm not putting all of us collectively as a society down. We're human beings. We want comfort. If we're not given another way to seek communion with one another, purpose in life, comfort, intimacy, those types of things, then we'll go where we're told to go. I don't look down on people for doing that, but I do think it's one of the major challenges and missions of our time to expose that process and break it open so that people can define for themselves a more meaningful and freer way of life. But I'll let you conclude with your thoughts about that if you like.
Well, I agree. Basically, I think that after the workers when they work 16 hours per day, and then now our consumerist time, it's going to come probably even more complicated moment when the robots do the job, and for a while we are going to be just consumers, but people in power who are are going to be the owners of those robots and other systems will realize that not even consumers are necessary. And what are we going to do? Not even as a consumers, so probably as trash, inconvenient trash. But that could be also the end of not just those people in power, but also of the planet. We are already destroying the planet due to these habits of profit first, no matter what happened then. That is what big powers have been doing until now. Profit first, and the planet is being destroyed. And we have just one planet. So that's very, very important, serious issue in this century.
Well, there's so much more we could talk about, and I hope we have another opportunity, but I think we need to leave it there for time reasons. So once again, Jorge Majfud, that's Majfud, is a writer and associate professor at Jacksonville University. His piece, which I highly recommend, in Common Dreams, published June 10th, is entitled Consumerism, Another Inheritance from the Slavery System. Jorge, thank you for...
Yeah, because I'm sorry for interrupting, because,
sure.
for example, we have a serious tradition here that is based on the old slavery system, which is the electoral system. You know
sure.
that. Electors, you need more more votes in California than in Louisiana or in other unpopulated central state to have one elector, but also you have only two senators in California. They have 40 million people there, and the same two senators in Iowa or in North Dakota, etc. Alaska, they don't even have 1 million. They have two senators. So, and all those states are very conservative, and that was designed during the 18th and 19th century in order to let the slave state to participate. If not because of the population, most of them were black people. They were not human beings at that moment, not even citizens. So that way they were able to participate. So that is a very concrete and very specific inheritance of the slavery that we are living in today. And the American people will need someday to have a huge, deep discussion about that. And there are many, for example, big cities in big states like Texas or like New York, California, etc., but northern states as well, are the residents of Black, Latino people, etc. Why that? That was another inheritance of the post-war reality. Black people had no way to survive but to work on services in big cities. And that tradition continued. And the ghettos were framed by huge highways. That was not a coincidence, etc., etc. So we're living in that past. But because of modern stuff, many people think that we made a lot of progress. We did, but we still have a long way to have a decent, democratic, and open discussion about reality, not about just myths.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And again, Jorge Majfud, thank you for the great writing, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
Same here. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.